I'm a guard on that building in the main hospital. I'm work 10 in the evening and 6 in the morning. This is the quiet time. No more people. I'll show him there at the first floor. Oh, that's a ghost. That's a ghost.
I love stories like this. Ghost stories.
A lot of torture places, a lot of people die there.
We heard a voice.
About places we're not supposed to go. We're warned not to go. But I'm no ghost hunter. The fear, the superstition, always hides a bigger story. A true story. What really happened here? And if you knew, would you still go there? Clark Air Base, the Philippines. A former U.S. military facility. It was the largest American base overseas. It was huge, sprawling, and the Americans operated here for almost 100 years. Long enough for plenty of ghost stories to emerge. Especially from one place, Clark Hospital.
I cannot forget that day, 1973 May. I'm a guard on that building in the main hospital. I'm happy because this is my first time duty. Big building, many cars, many people. But I'm work 10 in the evening and 6 in the morning. This is the quiet time. No more people. Very quiet. I just walk around every hour. Every hour I'll check my post. In the midnight, after nobody people are working inside, I hear the noise of those boots in the cement. My body got cold. All my body. But my feeling, I feel in my hand, my head. Oh, God. What's wrong to me? I'll show him there at the first floor. He's a big guy. He have a fatigue camouflage, a complete uniform. And when I look the face, no face. My heart, it just bump. I scared.
Hey, buddy, you gonna smoke?
They take the cigarette in my hand. It's very cold. Very cold. Just like you feel the ice. After I could not see anymore, Even my cigarette, I could not see where they bring it, the cigarette. He just go away. After close the door at the back, and I'm stay there in my outpost, I feel my hand and I look like that in my face. I told my body, oh, that's a ghost. That's a ghost.
I don't believe in ghosts. My theory was that by looking into the past, into what really happened here at Clark, I'd find some true horrors. Real events that could help explain all the ghost stories and what gave this place its eerie reputation.
Hey, buddy, you gonna smoke?
Clark was built way back in 1903. What went on at the base that caused so many people to fear it? Ramon, the security guard, claimed he encountered the ghost soldier at the base hospital. That was the place to start. Angeles City, Angel City. Not quite the kind of place the name suggested. Once a humble provincial town, the large American presence changed everything. It became a city with all kinds of entertainment and distractions for the American GIs. It was from here that I needed to get to Clark Air Base.
Hey, Kuya, can you take me to Clark Air Base Hospital?
Yes, sir.
Yeah?
Yes, sir.
Okay, great.
This is where the GIs came for R&R. But the story I was after was on the base itself.
Do you believe the hospital's haunted?
Ah, yes, really.
How come?
So many soldiers, American soldiers, there's so many died at the hospital.
Hard to believe this was once a place that cared for soldiers on death's door. There were no signs of it having been a hospital in the past. What was happening here when it was operational that might have caused Ramon to believe he saw a ghost soldier?
Upon closer inspection, the building must clearly have been built in the 60s, and yet you get the feeling that the people who left here in a hurry. It just makes you wonder why, what could have happened here, and you can see why so many people tell ghost stories about this place.
Clark Air Base Hospital is a state-of-the-art facility designed to give U.S. soldiers the very best in medical care.
I went through archival footage of the hospital looking for answers.
At a cost of $4.5 million and completed in 1964, Clark Hospital.
Then I discovered its purpose: treating all those heavily wounded in Vietnam. The U.S. Air Force dramatically increased its presence in Southeast Asia in the 1960s, as the Americans became more deeply involved in the Vietnam War. Clark Air Base was the hub that provided logistical support to the Americans fighting in Vietnam. Soldiers from various branches of the U.S. military came through Clark. That's why the base was enormous, over 620 square kilometers. Mike Scully had been an Air Force medic at the base hospital. He agreed to show me around.
That's Kelly Cafeteria, and that was the Kelly Theater. We're coming up here on the riding stables, and this was the NCO club, I think, until the early 80s.
And what was the mood on base and in the hospital as far as wartime or things like that?
I arrived in early May of 1975, and the fall of Saigon was sometime in early April of 1975. As far as the veterans coming back from Vietnam, that was done by the time I got here. That was finished.
What was the hospital like back when you were here?
We had a huge airmen's club, an NCO club, an officers club. It would be a free steak and free drinks, and they'd bring in boxing matches or boxers from Manila.
I've actually heard a lot of ghost stories from guards and such, the Filipinos who worked there. While you were at the base, did you hear anything like that?
I really don't remember hearing the stories when it was there. The hospital was the best place I ever worked in my life. This was considered to be paradise.
When Mike dropped me off at Clark's main gates, I decided to explore the neighborhood. You could see why this would have been paradise for some GIs. But Mike had a different perspective, that of someone who had been at Clark after the Vietnam War ended. To get a better sense of life on the base, I needed to talk to someone other than Mike. Harry the horse?
Hey, I'm looking for Harry the horse.
He's upstairs.
Are you Harry the horse?
Oh, yes, indeed. The one and only. Come on in.
Great. I was told that you were the man to talk to find out stories about Clark.
I've had a little bit of history of Clark, yes.
You were here just around the end of the Vietnam War. What was the awareness of the scale of the death and casualties?
We were not really, maybe it's just me, but life was going on as such, you really didn't think about that. When the base was here, it was wonderful. For Americans, the expats, retirees. So it was paradise.
It's interesting you say paradise, because I keep hearing that phrase, but I mean, there must be more to the story than that. How aware were you of the war and its casualties while being stationed here? How present did that feel?
And of course, this was the hospital they brought him into. This is where the mortuary was. So people were aware, but as far as directly thinking about it every day, you really didn't think about it at that time.
I'm looking into Clark's haunted stories. What can you tell me about those?
Filipinos are so superstitious anyway, it doesn't take much to convince them there's a ghost somewhere. I don't care. Most of the other people don't care. No ghost is going to come and bother me. I just hope if I see one, she's good looking.
Like Mike, Harry the horse saw Clark Air Base as a kind of tropical paradise. But there was a dark side, even if he didn't want to talk about it.
Dennis is arriving in the Clark Air Base Hospital in the Philippine Islands.
Clark Air Base in the Philippines, an American military outpost abandoned in 1991. I came to investigate rumors of a ghost soldier haunting the base hospital, which I suspected was connected to traumatic events here. But the guys I'd met who lived on the base made it sound like it was practically a resort. Clark was the major logistical hub for the Americans during the Vietnam War. It was a bloody war that lasted 2 decades. A long, drawn-out conflict, with stories of massacre, rape, and torture coming from both sides. Clark Hospital would have seen many of the wounded, and many of the dead.
It's his turn to examine the arrival.
This could have inspired the story of the ghost soldier, and explained why many people believed Clark Hospital was haunted. Then I discovered the hospital wasn't the only hotspot of ghost sightings on the base. I contacted local journalist Ding Cervantes, who had covered paranormal stories in the area. He agreed to show me other locations on the base that were believed to be haunted.
This place where we are is one of the reputedly most haunted places in Clark, in this former U.S. military base. And there's a story to it. You know, this building, it used to be a former cemetery for people who fought U.S. wars. I remember a few years ago, I did interview a security guard who was stationed here, who related to me hearing noises that terrified him. Chains being dragged. Voices being heard despite no one else being here. As well as seeing translucent figures of white lady gliding across a portion of this building.
Where do these stories of hauntings come from? Are the people who tell these stories locals?
Locals mostly, yes.
Ramon was a local, and Harry the horse had also mentioned it was locals who believed these stories. I needed to understand the mindset of local Filipinos and their relationship to the supernatural. Metaphysicist Frank Regis agreed to meet me to tell me more.
So I've really noticed, Frank, that a lot of the stories that I've heard have been from the locals and not from expats. Do you think there's a reason for that?
Filipinos are generally Eastern, and it springs from their original indigenous belief system that life goes on. When people die, there is an afterlife. The consciousness continues. But since they're no longer normally visible and physically, they're usually called ghosts. We can visualize the world as a grid, and there are positive grids and there are negative grids, and they are generally determined by the energy that happened in that place. Now, most hauntings usually happen in a negative grid, and these are places where there's a history of violence and a history of pain, okay? Some really intense feelings happening. Could be even conflicts. War is violent. That kind of death, which is sudden and violent, leaves a very painful residue or memory in the consciousness of the person. That will always leave a negative imprint in the place.
The idea that certain places have a negative imprint was intriguing, and Clark was beginning to sound exactly like that to me. I went back to Ramon the security guard, who was at the base during the Vietnam War. I hoped he could shed light on the link between the ghost sightings and the bad memories in the minds of those who fought in the war.
In Vietnam War, they have sick, they bring it here. Some other they have shot, some another we don't have any hand, some another they got burned, body. Every day, night, every day, like that. This is the parking lot, and where the people, they come through the bus here. 6 bus loads every night, every day.
6 bus loads?
Yeah, they brought here.
And then how many people per bus?
I know the capacity of the bus, 60 people.
6 buses per person? That's more than 200 a day?
Yeah.
Wow.
You know, the American, he's very strong, not like a Filipino. I got shot, But the American, no. He's strong, he just gets cigarette.
So once the injured people arrived, where were they taken?
They bring it here through the basement.
Can you show me where they went?
Yeah, I show you.
This was the other side of paradise, the side some people never saw.
This is the hallway. this area. I intersect those.
This is where you saw your soldier, your smoking soldier.
Yeah. I saw the ghost between this area. That
Right here.
ghost. Right here. This is the area. He is not for the living people. No people, anybody go here. This is a restricted area because this is storage. Many people die. They stuck here. The body, he just bring it there at the basement.
There were bodies stored in the basement?
Yeah. Dead woman, dead children, dead men. He just leave it here. That's why this restricted area. I can't go there because after that you hear many noise.
Noises?
Yeah, noise. Sometimes you hear the, help me, help me. That's why I don't want to go there in this area.
I went to explore the basement alone. It was one eerie place. Scrawled graffiti, warnings. Furnace.
Looking around, feasibly, you could put bodies down here or bury bodies down here. But, you know, it just looks like engineering rooms, mechanical rooms, all things that would naturally be in the basement of a building this large just to keep the structure running. And the real question then is, why would you bury bodies in a hospital?
The cemetery. I met veteran John Gilbert, who helped maintain Clark's cemetery.
It was originally laid out for 12,000 graves, so we still have over 25% that can still be utilized. You see the whole...
So there's still room then? There's still room?
Oh, yes.
Why would there be rumors then, if there's room here, that in the 70s the Clark Air Base Hospital was burying bodies in the basement?
I think that that is one of those unfounded rumors that kind of goes along with some of the local superstitions. There may have been bodies that were kept there for a while in the morgue pending decision from the next of kin for determination of what to do with the remains. But that's just simply not the way military medicine handles remains.
According to John Gilbert, the story about bodies buried in the hospital basement amounted to an urban legend. No doubt the number of dead and dying who passed through here inspired the tale. But I wanted to track down soldiers who had survived the Vietnam War and still lived on Clark.
Both of you gentlemen served in Vietnam?
I was intensely involved for 28 months. The first 6 months I was down in the jungle, and I saw some guys their legs all blasted away and blood and all this and gore and all that. Count my blessings, yeah? And there was a lot of pot smoking went on. A lot. Big time. They saw all their buddies getting shot. They saw all the blood and the gore. I mean, these guys were all nerved, rattled up, yeah? Many came back with psychological problems, yeah? Many. Big time. Did everything to kind of forget the bad stuff. And they came back here damaged.
They didn't recognize the mental things that the people go through. That what you see today maybe don't bother you today, but next week it bothers you 10 years down the road.
Post-traumatic stress.
What did they go through here?
Just think of yourself being put away in the most despicable place, not having a bed to sleep in, not having a pot to pee in, not having a place to poop.
For 5 years?
Yeah, for 5 years or 6 years. That you couldn't bathe, you couldn't clean, I mean, you had nothing. How would you feel at the end of the year? Would you be able to go out and talk in society? No, you wouldn't. Okay, let's face facts. These people.
Yeah. Hey, Joe's an emotional Irishman, yeah?
I am. They deserve our greatest respect.
They're still in bad shape because they were not given the top kind of mental care that they're given today, yeah?
There were so many dead and wounded in Vietnam. But it became clear talking to Joe and Cliff that what was almost worse was the walking wounded. The war spawned the coining of a medical condition, Vietnam Syndrome. Those who arrived at Clark and whose past continued to haunt them after they left. Joe mentioned mental care, ghosts in the minds of men. These weren't the supernatural ghosts like the one Ramon believed he saw. These hauntings were very real. I had been looking for what might have inspired the story of the ghost soldier at Clark Hospital. I discovered that what was really haunting Clark was its past, the Vietnam War. The wounded that were flown from Vietnam to Clark Hospital in the Philippines suffered from more than just physical injuries. Often the trauma of war haunted them long after war was over, and this trauma was a sort of ghost that never left, even when the lights were on. Clark was one of the most modern hospitals of its time. But did it really have a mental ward to care for those psychologically damaged from battle? Something felt off about the place. Stripped bare, the rooms appeared more like rows and rows of cells, one after the other. What kind of stuff went down here?
Well, here you go, proof positive that there was a psych unit or mental health clinic here behind the Clark Air Base Hospital.
I turned to Vietnam War expert Dr. Andrew Wiest for some insight into the need for a psychiatric ward.
I can only presume that the psychic injuries that wound up at Clark were worse than the ones the guys had to deal with in Vietnam. So the facilities...
Dr. Wiest explained that Clark had been a hospital for some of the worst casualties of the war in Vietnam. Those who suffered both physically and psychologically.
So what's the difference between Vietnam Syndrome and PTSD?
Vietnam Syndrome and PTSD are actually the same thing. It's essentially soldiers seeing so much trauma in combat that they come home changed. Vietnam Syndrome was the same thing that soldiers have been seeing ever since war began. War destroys young men's souls. And in this case, what in World War I had been called shell shock, in World War II was called combat exhaustion. After Vietnam was called Vietnam Syndrome, or what's later called post-traumatic stress disorder. PTSD isn't simple. PTSD involves everything from flashbacks to nightmares to being unable to function in society.
So if PTSD hadn't been diagnosed yet, how did the doctors treat it?
Their job was to stick a Band-Aid on these soldiers' minds and send them back to battle as often as they could. So did they deal with PTSD? Did they attempt to cure it? They couldn't have.
So the ghost stories from the security guards, do you think those are inspired by terrible things that happened here?
These are places of immense trauma, of immense psychic suffering. And I have no doubt that these places would have remnants of that psychic suffering to this day. But very few veterans would have gone back to Clark. They probably want to go to where it happened, as opposed to where it was dealt with the first time, if that makes sense. So like if you're wounded in the Hurricane Katrina down here, you probably want to go to New Orleans, not go to the hospital you were treated in.
It was clear Vietnam was horrific for the soldiers that fought there. PTSD was as yet an undiagnosed condition that continues to the present day, haunting modern soldiers in places like Afghanistan and Iraq. The war, the death, the killing haunts them long after they've left the battlefield.
While several elements of the Marine assault team were being
But then I realized all the horror in the Vietnam War wasn't the only thing that left such a huge psychological scar on Clark Air Base. There was more to the base's past. 15 years before Vietnam, it was involved in an even deadlier conflict.
In World War II, it was called combat exhaustion.
The casualty figures were astounding. Vietnam numbers were huge, but World War II numbers were off the charts. 60 million killed in 6 years, up to 1 million in the Philippines. And Clark was right in the middle of it. December 1941. A day after Pearl Harbor, the Japanese attacked Clark Air Base.
The Philippines in 1941.
American and Philippine forces withdraw to the Bataan Peninsula.
The Army Air Forces had delivered the goods prepaid.
April 1942. The U.S. surrenders the Bataan Peninsula to the Japanese. 75,000 Filipino and American troops are forced to make a 104-kilometer march to prison camps. Many were denied food, water, and medical care. Those who couldn't march were killed. As many as 11,000 prisoners died. It became known as the Bataan Death March. They walked right past the Clark Air Base main gate. I needed to know more about what the Japanese did at Clark in World War II. Was this why so many believed the base was haunted? I had a hunch there was even more dark history lurking in the past here. But even I couldn't have imagined what I discovered.
Everything I've seen and heard looking around here, you definitely get a sense of the history here, all the hardship and battles that this place has witnessed. One thing that I discovered that I was surprised to find out was that the Japanese kamikazes, the famed suicide bombers, were originally founded here. What the circumstances were and how that came to be, I'm not certain yet, but I'll find out.
The kamikaze had been based in Mabalacat, a town like Angeles City right next to Clark. That was my next stop. It looked like any other ordinary house along the street. But the strangest thing was it had a Japanese rising sun flag on the front porch.
Hello. Hey, this plaque is correct? This is the birthplace of the kamikazes?
Yes, it was.
Give your questions.
It seemed I had found the home of the kamikazes, And this man claimed he had witnessed the very first training of the kamikazes in this very house.
So this is the room.
Yeah.
Where did you see all the pilots, the kamikazes?
Well, they were squatted here.
Yeah?
They were, you know, they were in G-strings, you know, like this. Yeah. And with just the white clothes wrapped around right here, and they were listening intently. And then standing up here is a guy with a stick and pointing at the vessels, showing them the different kinds of vessels of the American warship.
And where were you?
I was peeping right here, looking at them.
Why did the Admiral pick this house?
I believe they did that because it is closer to the airfield where the pilots will fly from.
Where is that airfield?
It is about less than a kilometer away from this place.
I went to the airfield that Fernando mentioned and discovered bomb shelters there. Ironically, they were for the kamikaze pilots. So Clark Air Base really was the birthplace of this horrific war tactic, using airplanes themselves as weapons. The first kamikazes flew from Clark in 1944, when Admiral Takejiro Onishi's Special Attack Unit placed 250-kilogram bombs on fighter planes and targeted U.S. carriers. That the kamikazes had begun right here at Clark was bizarre enough. But as I walked through the airfield, things got even stranger. A kamikaze monument that seemed to honor the loss of Japanese lives, despite all the atrocities they had committed in the Philippines. Why would this be here?
I'm at the kamikaze monument next to the airfield, and I found a little bit of information that kind of puts this in context. 2 days before, on the 17th of October, 1944, American ships had appeared at Suluan Island at the mouth of Leyte Gulf. So maybe this is why the Japanese kamikazes took such desperate measures. I have a researcher historian here. I'm going to contact him to see if this is true.
Historian Dan Dizon runs a kamikaze museum from his home in Angeles City.
These are the first kamikazes in the Philippines, the earliest, the 201st Air Group. This is Mawarakat, this is the commander.
So all of these men here, they were all kamikaze fighters.
There, the commander of the first unit. And that is his 250-kilogram bomb that sank the St. Lo.
So this plane sank this ship?
Yes. They come very high, and then suddenly they plunge direct to the target. And it was Admiral Onishi who came precisely to the Philippines on October 19. On the 20th, they were initiated into the organization for suicide mission.
So the idea came about, and then 5 days later?
They started hitting targets.
Before then, what happened? What existed?
They are merely fighter pilots.
They were just regular fighter pilots?
Regular fighter pilots, yeah.
That's a really short time frame.
Very short time, because the situation at the time for the Japanese was very precarious, very dangerous.
Dan explained that the Japanese were in such a hurry to get the kamikazes off the ground because they were surrounded by American naval vessels, edging closer to Clark in the closing stages of World War II. The strength of the U.S. warships meant they couldn't attack them in a conventional way. Desperate, they resorted to suicide missions.
What do you think motivated the individual pilots?
What was inculcated in their minds is that by serving as a suicide pilot, they are saving the eventual occupation of Japan and the imperial family. you give your life to the emperor and to the nation.
My investigation began with reports of an American soldier haunting Clark Air Base in the Philippines. The base hospital saw thousands of the dead and dying returning from Vietnam. But then I discovered the true haunting, the ghosts inside their heads. But there were other reasons why so many locals believed Clark was haunted. That led me to World War II and the brutal Japanese occupation of the Philippines. That's when I made another shocking discovery. The first kamikazes flew to their deaths from Clark Air Base. With so much tragedy, it's no wonder some locals believed Clark was cursed.
That kind of death, which is sudden and violent, leaves a very painful residue.
Nearly 50 years later, an act of God would force the Americans to abandon Clark.
About 15,000 American service personnel were evacuated after a Philippines volcano dormant for 6 centuries began to explode.
Bad juju indeed.
Villagers from a 12-mile radius of the mountain fled the area.
And over 700 people died. I decided to call cultural historian Dr. Bautista to find out why some locals thought Mount Pinatubo was more than just an act of nature.
What are the local beliefs surrounding the Mount Pinatubo eruption?
There was a perception that the American occupation of Clark was the venue for a lot of social problems, like prostitution, like illegal markets, and all sorts of vice-related activities. So there was a great amount of resentment brewing about the American occupation. There were certainly some people who believed that Mount Pinatubo was God's way of redressing a very, very significant social issue.
Do you think all these ghost stories come from the negative history surrounding Clark?
All sorts of folkloric myths had been existing well before the American occupation in Clark. It is possible that the trauma of the Pinatubo eruption and also the negative effects of American colonialism had exacerbated and enhanced those myths.
In the end, it took a so-called act of God for the Americans to leave and to change Clark Air Base forever. The ghosts here seemed born of trauma and suffering inflicted on Clark Air Base and Angeles City during 2 major wars. And there was one place emblematic of the last 100 years here. I went back to see John Gilbert at the Clark Cemetery.
So how long ago do the earliest graves here date back to?
The earliest grave we have is a Philippine scout soldier. He was killed in 1900.
1900?
Yes, 113 years ago.
All the graves here, how many wars are represented?
All of the major conflicts of the last century. There are people buried here who saw action in Nicaragua, Dominican Republic, the Boxer Rebellion, as well as all of the major World War I, World War II, Korean War, Vietnam.
So this is literally more than a century worth of veterans buried here.
Yes.
For almost 100 years, this place was wrapped in conflict. I'm not sure if it has any real ghosts, but history certainly haunts it.